Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's bi-weekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Raphael Bostic, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website. If you have any questions for Dr. Bostic, just use the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you'd like to contribute to the discussion on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. As president of the Atlanta Fed, you have access to real-time information about the economy in your region, which includes Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, as well as portions of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Why don't we get started by, if you could tell us a little bit about the effects of COVID-19 on the regional economy.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, Howard. It's good to see you, and I want to thank the TPC for allowing me to talk here. You know, the COVID crisis at its heart is a public health challenge, and the response to that public health challenge really mandated a real contraction in terms of economic activity, and that's pretty much what we've seen across the board. So we've seen hits to cash flow for families, we've seen hits to revenues for businesses, and it's created a lot of stress and uncertainty for many. And what that really translated to was numbers that we knew were going to be quite bad. So you think about what happened in the data on job losses, 22 million jobs lost in a very short amount of time. That was expected. What was unexpected for me, I would say, is how robust the bounce back has been off of that, and to have over 7 million jobs return in a very short period of time kind of surprised me. But one of the things that it suggests is that a lot of the relief efforts that were undertaken by us at the Fed, we were quite bold and some of the earliest actors, but also on the fiscal side, have really made a difference, right? They made a difference for businesses, and it's allowed them to be positioned to take people back once we got through some of the trough. And it's also helped families as well. You know, I looked at some of the data at the very beginning of this. I had an expectation that perhaps we would see a spike in evictions or foreclosure as families were unable to meet their needs, their bills, because they didn't have cash flow. But that really hasn't happened. And to me, that's a sign that a lot of the relief that's gotten out there has actually done its job, and it's really positioned us to have people in a much stronger position than they might have been otherwise.
So you were quoted the other day in the Financial Times as saying that you thought that the rebound may be leveling off a little bit. Give us a sense of what you're seeing. Have we seen something of at least a little bit of a peak, and are we now kind of sliding back?
Well, some of the real-time data that's coming out is suggesting that we are kind of seeing a flattening out of the trajectory of recovery. In terms of businesses opening, for example, there is definitely signs that we may be reaching a plateau. One thing I'll say is that, I have a lot of staff that go out and they talk to people all the time. And one of the things they're hearing is that there are signs that their clouds may be building for both families and for businesses. Families, there's some evidence suggesting they're starting to tap into savings a bit more robustly, and also looking to use credit more intensely. For businesses, we're seeing the same thing, where a lot of them are saying, look, some of the relief through the Paycheck Protection Act and other things has been great, but we're starting to get through all that and spend that money, and it's really uncertain what's going to happen, given that demand hasn't recovered so robustly as it was sort of before the crisis. And then I'm also hearing that governments are starting to feel the pinch as well. The reduction in sales tax, the closing of some businesses and shuttering down has really hurt them in their capacity to have funds to continue to provide services as well. So there are all these clouds, and a lot of the question will be in the next month or so, as these things expire, what does the landscape look like at that point? Are there new relief packages that are offered? And how well can businesses and families be resilient in the face of the continued challenges?
So you're in a particularly interesting situation. Georgia and Florida opened their economies early. State political leaders did not support social distancing or the wearing of masks. And they're now seeing large increases in reported COVID-19 cases. Florida, I see, is reporting 10,000 cases a day. Has this begun to affect their economies locally? And what lessons can we learn from this experience?
Well, let me say a couple things. So one is that regardless of what the legal context is and what you could do, there are things that I think that we should be thinking about should do in the should do space. And one of these issues is really around following the advice of public health officials. I'm not a doctor, and so I'm not best positioned to know what the best approaches are. But just about every doctor I've talked to has said largely the same thing, that wearing masks, washing your hands, trying to do social distancing, these are the things that reduce the spread of the virus and the pace of its spread. And so I have no reason to doubt that. What I will say, though, is that if we don't do those things and we start to see spikes, that could undermine the confidence that people have in the economy and make them less comfortable and willing to engage in the things that we need them to engage in to have sort of a robust recovery. So I do worry about that. We are seeing, and I said this a little bit earlier, but people are starting to get a little more nervous, both families and households, but also businesses, about the prospects of the recovery and its trajectory potentially being much bumpier than maybe they had hoped for before. And so the long run solution here has got to involve managing that public health crisis, which was the spark for all of this at the outset. And so it's something we definitely have to pay attention to. And I'll just tell you, in our district, there's been a lot of variation in terms of conformity to the public health guidelines. And in some sectors, say hospitality, say tourism, I have heard concerns that the lack of the following through on these things and some of the change in the trajectory of infections and the spikes are leading to uncertainty and worry that could adversely affect the recovery and actually prolong the time that's required for us to get back to where we were pre-crisis.
Let me ask you a little about the Fed. And this is obviously a very unusual economic situation, nothing like anything we've ever seen before. And I wonder, in your view, how does it affect the Fed's ability to use standard monetary policy tools to increase output? And I'm thinking, for example, increasing a firm's access to capital at a time when workers are unwilling or unable to work and shoppers are unwilling or unable to shop seems less effective than it would be in a typical slowdown. Tell me a little bit how you think about this.
Well, this is the challenge that we're all wrestling with. I talk about this with my team continuously. Look, we've taken Fed funds rate to zero, and we've got such uncertainty in the marketplace as to willingness to make long-term investments, willingness to borrow and do all those sorts of things. Like, what are the types of things that the Fed can do? For me, I think at this stage, the most important things are to make sure that the basic gears of the economy can continue to function. That's why you saw so many of these facilities issued on our behalf right at the beginning to say, we don't want our financial markets and the vehicles by which businesses access capital to shut down, because that will lead to a much greater level of chaos. What I would say is we are going to continue to provide all the signals that we can, that we're going to support the economy, and we're going to try to provide and ensure that there's enough relief out there for businesses as we can. But monetary policy and the tools that we have do have constraints. And so the fiscal side is going to be an important partner as we move forward. And it's one of the reasons that as I go around and I talk to businesses and I talk to families, when I hear that there are weaknesses and challenges, I call policymakers. We try to engage them to make sure that they know the same things that we do, so that if there's policy that's going to come, it comes in a timely fashion.
So a little more broadly, what have you learned from the current national situation, as well as the Great Recession, about labor markets and how much we can encourage job growth without rekindling inflation?
Well, the inflation issue has been something that has been kind of a conundrum. So, we've been through 11 years of robust growth, and inflation has not been an issue throughout that entire time. we called out 2% as a target. And for 8 years, we haven't really been able to get back to 2% in a fairly accommodative position. One of the things I think it suggests is that the way work is being done and the way that workers engage in the labor market and in economies has evolved in a way such that there is there's a greater potential for absorbing them. And when I started here, we had a natural rate of unemployment that we thought was in the 5% range. I actually think is less than 4 as a practical matter. And this episode notwithstanding, I think we have to rethink what pressure in labor markets and what an overheated economy looks like. Another thing I would say is that we've learned, and we implemented that here, is that it's preferable to act big and bold at the very beginning, signal your intention to provide that support. That's the way that you take some uncertainty out of decision making for families and for businesses, and allow them to really worry about some other things, and hopefully put a floor on how low economic activity is going to be. And I think our experience in this period has suggested that that's exactly right. A lot of the financial markets where we've seen stresses have really moved away from breakdown levels. There's elevated risk certainly because there's a lot of uncertainty, but markets are functioning, and I think that's a sign that a lot of the things that we did worked.
Another inflation question. So as you mentioned, overall inflation is essentially zero, but food prices rose quite a lot, 4% in May. And this is likely putting a strain on the budgets of families who are either unemployed or have faced large drops in income. Is there anything that can be done to protect people from increases in the prices of food and other necessities?
Well, I think that this is a difficult problem, and it's difficult for 2 reasons. One, a lot of the delivery channels that we have are extremely specialized. And so so I think about my daily routine. Pre-virus, I ate lunch at work. I would often eat dinner at a restaurant, and the delivery channels to get food to those places is quite different than it is to go to a commercial grocery store. And so when I'm not doing that anymore and I'm going to those grocery stores, that's extra demand that our channels really aren't well suited to meet. And we are seeing evolution in that as we move forward. So that's going to be a challenge just as a baseline. And it really gets to the point of what does it mean to have an agile and resilient economy, and how quickly can you transition from providing services through one channel to providing services to another if conditions change pretty dramatically. But the second thing I would say is I think this has actually been more of a good news story in the sense that the relief packages have really shielded families from that challenge to date. So you think about the economic impact payments, those $1,200 checks. You think about the extra resources that have been made available through the unemployment insurance sweeteners. Those things have really positioned families to be able to weather this in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. And it's one of the reasons why I worry a lot about what happens when those expire, right? So you think about the unemployment insurance program that's slated to expire at the end of this month. And if families are now facing this cliff where they used to have some support, now they go to zero, I think that can have some really stark implications for how a lot of experiences are going to evolve. And it's something that I talk to policymakers about on a regular basis, and they know this and they're aware, and I'm hopeful that we'll find a way to keep the relief flowing to those that need it most.
So there's a flip side of this issue, and it's kind of a more difficult question, but let me throw it out at you. At what point do we allow failing firms to go under? How long can either fiscal or monetary policy continue to support businesses that may not be sustainable?
Well, that's a very difficult question. Here's what I would say. I think about our evolution going from pre-crisis into the crisis. We had lots of businesses that were working. We had lots of business models that were working, and those fundamentals were strong. To the extent that we can, I think the goal is to try to preserve those fundamentals and provide relief. At the same time, in many sectors, there were transitions and evolutions that were going on already. and that many businesses that were perhaps weaker in that chain were going to eventually go out of business because of competitive pressures. So one of the things that we've heard, and that I've heard from a lot of businesses, is that the virus crisis is accelerating a lot of the change and really leading to these structural changes happening much sooner than they might have otherwise. And one of the challenges that we face is really trying to distinguish between those situations where the relief is really for going to go to businesses that maybe we're not going to go out of business, and those where this is just pulling forward something that was going to happen anyway. And we work on that. We're talking to lots of people about that. I think the market is actually going to resolve a lot of this for us as they look through and evaluate different businesses and different business models and start to see some of the innovations that get put into place. And I think this is kind of going to sort itself out in the medium term. The one group that I do worry about, and I think it's perhaps not as relevant in this context, is the smallest of the small businesses who already had extremely thin margins and were not really well positioned to deal with like a protracted or extended shock. The loss there is probably not going to be due to structural change per se, but it is much more going to be due to a lack of liquidity that is sort of born out of the nature of how we finance and fund small business activity.
And that probably changes the nature of a lot of downtowns, a lot of smaller cities, small towns. So what happens?
So, I yell about this a lot. I mean, I don't know if you've seen me, a lot of my stuff on this, but you look at the 6th district, which is the southeastern United States, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee. I got a lot of small towns. I got a lot of towns that have like compact downtowns that are basically chock full of smaller businesses just like this. If we don't find ways to make sure that they're continuing to get the relief that they need, a lot of these places can hollow out in ways that would be extremely disruptive and painful for many, many people. I'm pleased to say that, if you look across my district, the share of businesses that have tapped into the PPP program is extremely high. I think Tennessee has the highest penetration in the country. I think that's a sign that this kind of support has been successful, and I'm hopeful that that as this crisis extends in its temporal arc, we find ways to continue to provide that support, so we don't lose that vital component of the American economic fabric.
Let me switch gears a little bit. You've been very outspoken about the economic price of systemic racism, which is a topic that rarely discussed by Federal Reserve officials in the past. You wrote a recent essay called "A Moral and Economic Imperative to End Racism," and you wrote that the Fed has the ability and the responsibility to link economic mobility and resilience to broader economic health. So how should the Fed do that? Are there specific things that you think the Fed could do? For example, should the Fed look beyond aggregate labor market data to particular groups, such as Black workers? Some have suggested the Fed should target Black unemployment rather than overall unemployment rate. What specifically can the Fed do about all this?
So I actually think there are a number of different things. One, and most people, when they think about the Fed, we think about our monetary policy, our interest rate setting stuff. For me, I think one of the biggest questions, and it's something that I've been wrestling with pretty much since I've been in this job, is what is the sufficient set of statistics to characterize how the economy is actually performing? And how should we think about the experience of Americans at different points in the income distribution and different points in the wealth distribution? Last year for our annual report, I held it one district, many economies, because there isn't just one economic experience. And so I think one of the things that we're doing, and frankly, while the Fed hasn't been talking about distributional things in a very public setting, it has been doing that more generally, internally, is thinking about, well, what are the metrics that we should have? And I think thinking about all these distributions and then having that inform what policy looks like is quite important. I actually think the conversation we had earlier about labor markets and how we can run economies hot for extended periods of time, maybe longer than even models would predict, and we haven't seen unemployment, suggests that we may want to alter our policy reaction function to shield or to sort of lean towards letting things run hot a little longer, because we know that that allows people who have been less connected to the economy to be have more of a chance to get those connections, and then we hope that we can sustain that. But I also want to say that there are other things that we're doing at the Federal Reserve system level that are important in this regard. One is we have a large community and economic development function that really is capturing a bunch of information about the types of things that can be effective in overcoming barriers to quality education, to workforce development, to building affordable housing, to doing all the things that create stresses that really prevent families from making long-term investments in themselves. You know, one thing I like to just remind people is that when people are under stress, they make worse decisions and their horizon for the decision shortens. All right, and those are things that work against making investments that change into your trajectory of well-being. So we are trying to deploy those things. One of the things that we've done at our bank is we've bolstered that group pretty significantly. And we are really focusing on outreach to make sure that policymakers at the local level are aware of things that are out there. Because many of these policymakers are working in governments that don't have a lot of excess capacity. They don't have time to do a lit review and figure out sort of which things are most effective. We need to be a powerful partner for them. And then the other thing I would say, we have a huge network, and we're working hard to bring experts, to bring philanthropy, to have this be a multi-sector solution. And while we don't have funds to do grants, when we invite people to come to a meeting, they usually show up, and it gives us an opportunity to really trigger and catalyze meetings and conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. And there's one last thing I did want to say on this, which is that we actually have an internal responsibility as well. There are a lot of practices that businesses and institutions can do to try to make sure that those who are less attached, that ethnic minorities and people of various sexual orientations and genders have real opportunities, because at the institutional level, if this is an institutional problem, we need institutional solutions. So each of us has a responsibility. And so my team is looking at all of our practices from job training and job development, to hiring, to outreach, to basic things like reimbursement policies, to make sure that we're not creating extra stresses that prevent African Americans or Latinos or whatever group you're in from being the most effective as you possibly can.
So we got a question on the chat asking again about the name of your essay. It's called A Moral and Economic Imperative to End Racism, and I assume it's available on the Atlanta Fed website.
Yeah, if you go on the website, actually, you could probably Google it, just my name, and say Moral Economic Imperative. It'll come up, or something that provides a link to it. So it's in a lot of places right now.
Let me follow along on this a little bit. You're a PhD economist yourself. A few weeks ago, my guest was Bill Spriggs, who wrote an open letter critiquing economists' poor understanding of how racial inequities and discrimination affects their results and their conclusions of their academic research. Do you agree with Bill, and how would you change the status quo?
So, you know, I've known Bill for a long time. He's a super smart guy, and I always enjoy listening to him and talking to him on these issues. I actually think that he's right. And the thing that I read the letter, and it made me think about sort of my work and how I was given, and not really reflect so much in terms of the technical work about sort of whether those inputs are shaped by other things that like historical aspects. So I do underwriting in credit markets. Personal wealth is a factor that determines whether you're going to get credit or not. But if you're an African American whose family for generations has been prevented from owning homes or buying into businesses or doing those things, you're going to have less wealth, right? And the field doesn't really acknowledge and talk about those institutional constraints that have historical arcs of over time that disadvantage people. And so we look for a lot of explanations that have a contemporaneous element, but that really causes the field to sort of turn its back on a lot of the more institutional factors that really do shackle groups and prevent them from being as competitive today. So in terms of fixing it, one thing that I've been in the essay, I spent the first part talking about historical events and historical practices. I think we actually need to know them a lot more, right? And that's true for African Americans. I think there's a huge history around the mistreatment of Native Americans. There's a Supreme Court ruling just this morning about the state of Oklahoma and how the land that should have been for Native Americans was inappropriately reclassified. There's a lot of this history that we don't know, and because we don't know it, I think it causes us not to really understand the burdens that people are carrying and the challenges they face. And without that understanding, it's hard to imagine we're going to come up with solutions that appropriately address the real problems. So I think there's a lot to do here. I think the historical aspect is first. And then another thing I would say, because I could talk about this for a long time, so I apologize, is that I think there's real value in talking to people who are living the experiences. I've been in many seminars where there's a conversation or a study about African Americans, and I'm the only African American there, right? And so I do think that opening up and broadening the set of voices that contributes to conversations, and that those voices are taken seriously and considered in an academic and respectful way, I think that would really advance our understanding, our ability to study these things in ways that would be helpful.
So I know you're a monetary policy guy, but we are the tax policy center. So I have to ask you, how can tax policy target racial inequality?
Well, tax policy is a huge issue. You think about property tax, you think about income tax, you think about sales tax, and the incidence of all these taxes, and who they and what that incidence then means for what people can do. Look, we know that that low-income families, minorities, and the like, they have fewer resources. So how taxes are designed and how they hit families and communities is critically important. I think there's also on the other side taxing to do what, right? And so how do we think about the funds that are available through our tax revenues and deploying them in ways to make sure that institutions have a comparable quality across communities and even within communities, so that our experiences are all the same. And then I think that we do need to be mindful of the voice that people have in establishing tax policy. And who do we talk to? How do we gain consensus in what the appropriate taxes are? And then really monitor to make sure we understand what those taxes are meaning for people.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. We have a question from Tori Gorman, and it's a Fed question. What's the status of Fed purchases of Treasury securities in the secondary market? If another major pandemic relief bill is required, can the Fed continue to expand its balance sheet? Is there a tipping point to the Fed's acquisition of Treasury debt, and what does that tipping point look like?
So I don't know if there's a numerical point where we go over some line. What I would say is I think that we stand ready to do what's necessary to make sure that the economy does not break down. We're going to do the things that we can to ensure that. The way that we're structured, we are a lender, not a spender, right? So all of these are loans. We're expecting them to get paid back. If the things that we do work, the economy should be well positioned and in a strong position to start to grow. And over time, our balance sheet will sort of naturally accrue back down to where it was before. So we are trying to be very strategic and very clear about what the objectives are. And I think the chair has been clear on this, and I echo his perspective on this. These are emergency settings, right? And these are not things that are intended to be around forever. So as we see that there are conditions that are settling down, I would expect that we will not continue to stand these up as perpetual programs.
So I don't know how your crystal ball is right now, but where's the economy going to be in a year?
So I think we'll be still growing and still in a recovery mode. The way that, so my outlook has always been that as we move into this recovery phase, we were going to see bumps along the way as we learn things about how the virus is progressing, as we learn how to do business in ways that, or in ways that allow us to continue to do commerce while at the same time minimizing the likelihood of becoming infected with the virus. And as we start to have those learnings, some of the experiments are going to work, some of them are not going to work. And that's going to trigger trends in data that are going to lead to retrenchment in some places and in some sectors. So I expected that bounciness to happen. The models that I'm looking at right now suggest that by the end of the year, we'll have more jobs and more growth than we have right now, but we won't be at a level that is equal to where we were pre-crisis. I don't think we're going to be at that stage until mid-2021 or maybe later into 2022. And so we're going to be in recovery mode. One other thing I would say is that, and this is an important thing to say, the recovery is not going to happen at the same pace across all communities and across all geographies. The virus did not come into our country sort of all at once, and we're still having our first wave in a lot of places to some extent. And so as we get to the backside, I would expect that we will see some communities that take much, much longer to recover and rebound. And we've done a survey of lower and moderate income communities that we're doing now as a series. One of the things that we've seen very clearly is they don't expect recovery to happen, many of them, in less than a year. So as we think about what support needs to be out there, we need to have in mind and be mindful of that distribution of time periods for recovery that's going to be required, and make sure we don't drop and lose focus and attention too soon.
Well, thank you. Well, Raphael Bostic, thank you so much for joining the Prescription. It's been great talking to you. President Bostic and his colleagues at the Atlanta Fed are eager to communicate with you, and they've asked us to put up a slide that shows some ways that you can communicate with them. So if the technology works, there it is. So take a look at that. You could get his essay on that website, as well as he said on Google. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you all again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Howard. It's good to talk with you.
Thank you very much.